Hello everyone, I'm Max without a spec guide. I have my Polestar 2 that I've owned for several months now, and my friend and colleague Ryan has owned this Tesla Model 3 for several months. And these cars are not directly comparable. Obviously, they're different manufacturers, different models. However, they're both broadly affordable-ish electric sedans. Ryan, you bought yours new, right?
That's right, I got it new.
You bought a new base rear-wheel drive Tesla Model 3. I think you've been really happy with it.
It's been great so far, yeah, really enjoying it.
I bought a Polestar 2, loaded out with the performance pack and all their trims. It was a launch model. It's depreciated a lot because a lot of their rental fleet has been decommissioned by Hertz. After about 2 years, Hertz will dump their vehicles. So they've been flooding the market, and that's been good news for buyers like me. In fact, they've depreciated even more since I bought it. So these cars have gone super cheap. But broadly, Ryan, what I want to talk about today is the trend in EVs of performance trims, because this applies to Polestar, it applies to Tesla, it applies to vehicles like the Mustang Mach-E, where you can get a spicy performance trim usually. And Ryan, what does that entail? What does that come with?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff, and of course the obvious stuff is faster acceleration, better top speed, different wheels and bumpers and stuff, a bit of a more aggressive look, but there's a bit more that goes into it than just the superficial stuff like that.
Yep, so in this video we're going to go over what actually goes into most performance trims and the most common EVs, and specifically using ours as examples. And when you go with performance trim, let's say you get it for the same price because you buy one used instead of new, or you choose to spend more for performance, what are you trading off? What are you getting and what are you losing? Let's discuss it. All right, Ryan, let's start with your Model 3 because I feel like this has become the new de facto standard car. If you have a budget where that meets this car's starting price, then this seems to be like the default EV to get.
Yep, it serves as a very good benchmark. I think pretty much most electric cars are often compared to Teslas, and this is the base entry-level version. So it is very much the standard entry-level Tesla that a lot of people will be looking at.
Yes, and interestingly, Ryan, in Tesla's lineup, until fairly recently, you had the choice of getting this or the dual motor performance, which jumped the price up from around $40,000 to like $54,000, right?
Right, yeah, a pretty big jump.
Yeah, and I'll put in some numbers. These may be inaccurate as of us filming the video because Tesla's always changing their prices, but they've reintroduced an all-wheel drive model for folks interested in that. So dual motors, has all-wheel drive. It's not the performance trim, so it's in between the two in pricing.
Correct. They call it the long-range all-wheel drive version, so it's got a bigger battery, more range, and all-wheel drive. And it's a good bit quicker than this one, not quite as fast as the performance, but a very good option if you don't necessarily want to get all of that performance, but you are interested in having more range, a little bit better charging speeds, stuff like that.
Yeah, so Ryan, yours has what, 18 or 19-inch wheels?
That's right, these are 18s actually.
Yeah.
And normally they come with aero covers. I've actually replaced them with these center caps.
They look much better in my opinion.
Yeah, I personally much prefer the look, and keep tuned. We'll have a video a little bit about these aero caps at some point.
Yeah, and out of spec reviews, people can look about the efficiency differences with taking those off, because I think that's going to be super interesting.
Yes.
But this is basically, yeah, you're getting the base rear-wheel drive trim, smaller wheels, which, maybe you could argue don't look as cool, but you're getting a more efficient car.
Yeah, it's extremely efficient, and again, because this is rear-wheel drive, there is no motor up front, so that means it's more efficient, and additionally, there's more room in the front trunk, so that's a little bit bigger. And with the smaller wheels, of course, there are actually slightly smaller brakes when compared to the performance trim, and smaller wheels also means smaller tires. And something that I think gets thrown under the rug a lot of times is smaller tires are a little bit cheaper than bigger tires.
A little bit cheaper and less impactful on your range.
That's right, yeah. So these are extremely efficient. I've found that they're actually acceptable in the snow and in the cold, fine in the rain, and they're fine enough on the street.
So Tesla, what are those Michelin all seasons that Tesla gives you?
Yeah, they're the like M4PX tires.
Yeah.
They are very solid, and every single tire is a compromise, whether it's grip, range, off-road performance, like everything, it's all a compromise. You have to decide what's important to you. And for the rear-wheel drive, efficiency is most important, and that's reflected with these tires. They're not going to be the grippiest things. They're not great for a track day or anything like that, but they've got very solid efficiency. They work in all the different weather conditions, and they're not crazy expensive.
Yep, and we live in Colorado, so if you were going up in the mountains, you wanted a dedicated winter tire, you absolutely can throw it on these wheels, and because of the smaller rim diameter, like you said, those are going to be slightly cheaper, and then brakes are going to be cheaper too. However, in an EV, we really don't have to change those as much, so it's not as big of a concern, but performance trim, Ryan, like you said, everything is just bigger, right? You get more front space because you have a rear-wheel drive car. You have smaller brake calipers when you do eventually, after 100,000 miles, have to replace your pads and everything. So all of that is just lower cost. It's simpler. You have a more efficient car in the day-to-day, and 0 to 60 time is still like 5.8 seconds in this.
Yeah, high 5-second range. It's acceptable.
Perfectly fine. You're gonna smoke a Chevy Spark.
Sure will, yeah.
Or your old Chevy Bolt if you ran into that on the road. I mean, it's a perfectly acceptable performance. And then we get into, if we want to switch around here to a car like I have. I bought this used Polestar 2, and I've really gotten to know it pretty well. I enjoy it a lot, but it being a performance trim comes with some of those trade-offs that contrast with what we learned about Ryan and his Model 3. So the big thing is that I have huge wheels and therefore huge brake calipers. This specific Polestar model has like a cool, Brembo calipers, and it has Öhlins suspension. This is very common across performance trims. You also see it in a vehicle like the Mustang Mach-E, where getting performance trim means you get higher end components. A Tesla Model 3 Performance is going to have sportier Michelin rubber, I believe Pilot Sport tires, and those bigger rims, therefore bigger brakes. We mentioned brakes, you don't have to replace as often. I'm not as worried about that. Yes, these are going to suck to replace, but I won't have to do it for quite a while, so it's not a huge concern. The big concern for me, and I recently encountered this, was tires. The tires I have on here right now, this rubber on the Polestar 2, is I got an all-weather tire, Pirelli Cinerados, not what it came with. It came with dedicated performance summer tires. They were awesome, but the thing about EVs is they tend to wear through tires quicker. Different, people have run numbers on this, but typically 30 to 40% quicker consumption through your tires with an EV. It's a heavier vehicle, especially you're getting a performance trim, dual motors, you're accelerating more often, you're creating more torque, you're basically wearing through your tires quicker. And that performance summer rubber, well, I basically worn through it. And even if I hadn't, because they were performance summer tires living in Colorado, I absolutely would need to get dedicated winter tires. And if you run dedicated winter, summer tires, normally you're a car enthusiast, maybe this isn't as big of a deal. But frankly, I think most of us, many people are in a situation where they want to just run one set of tires all year round. Maybe you don't live in Colorado where it snows a lot. It's not a huge concern. You probably want all-season tires. And when a performance trim comes with summer tires, great. They're going to perform great, like Ryan said, at a track day or in those circumstances, but they're not going to be the best compromise all around for most people, so you'll just end up doing what I did and have to get a more pedestrian tire that suits your day-to-day life. The best thing I could have done with this car to keep its performance characteristic would have been more expensive tires and whatnot, but I just basically compromised because I said, you know what, this is a daily driver. I'm going to get a year-round tire in my case. So I got a tire with a 3-peak non-snow rating. That's a lot about tires, but I feel like it's so important to talk about those with EVs because that's really the biggest consumable cost we're talking about here.
I know you mentioned you've got those bigger wheels and different suspension. What does that mean for your day-to-day driving?
Yeah, so wheels and suspension, great point, Ryan. The wheels, because they're large, typically result in less of a sidewall. So if I try to read the numbers, let's say on like your Tesla, I think your Michelins are running a 45 sidewall, despite being slightly narrower and also smaller rim tires. My tires only have a 40 sidewall. And that is a consequence of basically just space, right? Bigger rim, but a similar wheel well size because performance trims aren't making huge body modifications. So typically you get this cooler, imposing looking wheel at the cost of a narrower sidewall. What that means is the ride on this car, Ryan, tends to be less compliant. Now, this car has adjustable suspension. A lot of performance EV trims will have cool suspension. If it's coils, if it's springs, it's not air suspension, you can't really customize it a ton. These are adjustable dampers, but you're still dealing with fundamentally having to have a stiff suspension because EVs are, again, heavy. You combine that with a narrow sidewall. Ryan, I'm getting probably a slightly bumpier ride than what you would get in your Model 3. The other thing here is suspension components. So because it is Öhlins suspension in this car, that's a big benefit in the Polestars. it's manually adjustable. I have to put it on a jack stand to adjust it. I think that's kind of silly. Now I should say you get a Mach-E GT Performance that has Magna Ride that is electronically adjustable. A lot of high-end EVs, I believe like the Mercedes AMG EQS, you get into other price brackets, they're gonna have air suspension that's adjustable. That's really cool. That, like on a gas car, is very expensive, however, when you're gonna have to replace it. Air suspension is just one of those luxury components where it just gets ludicrously expensive. So EVs, right, long story short, brakes, engine, I mean, you don't have an engine, you have motors. These things, regardless of which trim you get, you're not gonna be replacing, but you are gonna be replacing those wear components like a suspension, especially after long-term ownership, not like a lease vehicle, but let's say you own it for 5 years, you drive it 80 to 100,000 miles, you're probably gonna need to put work into it. And that, I think, is a pretty significant thing people should know, Ryan.
Definitely, and I want to clarify, not every single vehicle is going to have their air suspension go out at 80,000 miles.
That's true.
But it's something that you should be aware of, that can happen, and it can be expensive.
Yeah, absolutely. Some air suspension lasts a while, but I'm just going off, for instance, let's say a performance vehicle like the Rivian R1T, performance in a slightly different aspect. It's not as much of a street-going vehicle. It's a off-road beast that also does well in the street. Our boss Kyle drives that truck, and I know he's had complaints about the suspension. It's really cool, it's a really cool design, but by being an air suspension, it is more complicated inherently. And the Rivian is an interesting case because that is a high-end vehicle. You cannot get, I believe, a Rivian R1T or R1S without air suspension, but that just broadly gets into choosing a cheaper EV versus a more expensive one. Now, other EVs I should mention, Volkswagen ID4, the Chevy Bolt EV and EUV, while they're still on sale in their current form. These cars are simpler. They don't have performance trims. They just, have nice things like sunroofs and interiors you can upgrade. They don't do the wheels and motors and other things. The other thing I wanted to get into, Ryan, is 0 to 60 times performance. Like we said with your car, it's not a big deal. Like in my Polestar, it's 4.2 seconds now. In a Model 3 Performance, it'd be significantly quicker, 3.1 seconds 0 to 60. That's really cool. Realistically, it's not going to be I think personally, something you use more than to show off. It's a gimmick of sorts to show, hey, look how quick my car is. And if that matters to you, that might be worth the price, but that's a high price to pay. And I don't know if you're going to really need that. Even like merging on the highway. Ryan, have you ever felt like you need more power with this?
I've never felt like I needed more power. Want is a different thing.
That's true. Wants versus needs. It's about prioritizing that. And Ryan, the cost of that, would be typically probably higher consumption, slightly less efficient motors, especially when you make that trade-off between having a rear-wheel drive car and a dual motor car. So like a Hyundai Ioniq 5, which they just came out with the Ioniq 5N. That's a vastly different variant on it. It's going to be a bit more expensive. We haven't tested that specific car yet, but I'm predicting it's going to be a little bit less efficient than the normal Ioniq 5.
Definitely, I can very easily agree with that.
And you can get the normal Ioniq 5 with dual motors. So if you live in a climate where you want to run snow tires and you care about all-wheel drive, and these are important things to you, most EVs do offer a mid-range dual motor trim. Mach-E does this, ID4 does this. Like I said, it doesn't even go into the performance territory. All these EVs have that option. I think it makes sense for so many people to do that if they care about it. And if you live in Florida, you live in California, you live in places where all-wheel drive is less of an issue, or you just are willing to put, dedicated winter tires on and you're not off-roading, a rear-wheel drive, or in some cases with EVs, a front-wheel drive car is perfectly fine, I think, Ryan, right?
Yeah, so I've never hidden this fact. I love cars, I love performance driving. But the reality is, I think that the vast majority of people don't need the most expensive performance trim of a car. It's awesome to have, and if that's what you want, absolutely go for it. I encourage you to do it, but don't feel like you have to just to get the biggest, baddest thing on the block. Don't feel like that's something you need to be worried about. A lot of times, the all-wheel drive one is perfectly adequate and does everything you need. And sometimes even the rear-wheel drive base model is plenty sufficient. Really, it's important to consider what's important to you, what you need, what you want, and what you can afford.
Yep. and budget that in. I talked about tires for so long because that's a big wear item, but really, realistically, you buy a performance trim EV, you're gonna spend more on components like that.
That's right.
And that's something to be aware of and budget for, keep in mind as well. It's not just the initial cost of the vehicle, the aftermarket, the components, some of those may be more expensive depending on the specific performance EV you're getting.
Yeah, so if you want the performance trim, 100% go get it, enjoy it. But if you're just of the opinion, you know, I think it'd be kind of cool to experience that. That'd be nice to go 3.1 seconds to 60. Go take it for a test drive once, you know, see what it's like, and then I think seriously consider a different trim, a lower trim, just all-wheel drive, or even the base trim. It might be able to fulfill all your needs, and sure, it might not be quite as quick, but if that's not super critical for you and your buying decision, don't make it one. Don't spend the extra money. Don't make it more expensive than it needs to be.
And Ryan, one more point I would like to end on is EVs, unlike a combustion vehicle, are not going to have that, you know, you can't get a manual transmission in one, or not a real one for a matter of fact, but you can't hear the engine noise. Yes, they are artificial noises, but those are software packages. So if you have lived with performance trims, V8s, whatever, in gas world, and you're expecting a similar experience in EVs, I can't necessarily say it's the same thing. Yes, I get that faster 0 to 60 number hypothetically. I hypothetically have more power, but like Ryan was saying, oftentimes even a rear wheel drive EV, the power is enough. Are you getting more car enthusiast cred for flashing fancier Brembo calipers or whatever? Maybe. But the subjective experience I have found often with a performance EV does not lend the same rewarding factor that a gas one does. I'm not saying gas is better than EV, I'm just saying in this specific area of enthusiasm, it's worth noting that when you go to an EV, you're not getting the same subjective benefits you often do with gas performance cars.
I think a great example of that's the Mustang. You can start out with a nice little EcoBoost Mustang 4-cylinder, a great car, or you can spend a bit more money and step up to the V8. And then you've got the sound, the vibration, all that stuff that makes it just so much more of an experience.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily the case with performance EVs. You've got more speed and more capable car, different suspension, all that stuff. But it doesn't quite feel quite as distinct when you compare it to the regular version.
Not quite as distinct. And maybe in some cases fewer trade-offs, because Ryan, like you said, the comparison of a 4-cylinder EcoBoost versus like a dark horse top trim Mustang, yeah, you're gonna have a huge fuel economy difference, right? Like for one, and the tires, wheels, all that. But with EVs, like we're noticing, okay, like Ryan, your car is more efficient than mine for sure. It's not that much of a delta though, because motors and all these things are being optimized. We're seeing less and less of that efficiency trade-off, but hopefully everything else we've mentioned in this video is significant because you should know about it. Basically, performance trims and EVs, they exist, they do things, but they may not do the things you want them to do.
Absolutely. It's a trade-off like all things, and it's worth considering and looking at both sides of the equation.
Hopefully, yeah, hopefully this has been helpful to you. This has just been our experience with our two vehicles here, the Tesla Model 3 Standard and a Polestar 2 Performance. The EV market's always evolving, and if you have, you know, Kia EV6 versus EV6 GT, Mach-E, other examples you actually owned and you want to comment on, Tesla Model 3 or why, performance versus non-performance. We've tested a lot of Teslas, and hopefully what we say is, you know, grounded in some of that. But if you have additional things to add, please do. And you can always email us, guide@specstudios.com, if you want to suggest other video concepts, other areas of the EV world you want us to explore. I hope this has been helpful for you as a prospective EV buyer or someone curious about that. Thank you so much for watching.